Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our first USCT Historical Trails program with Dr. Beth Kruse from Vicksburg National Battlefield. So anybody who is not aware, my name is Nia Crawford. I'm currently working with the African American Civil War Museum as the outreach coordinator. I've been here for about 2 years now, and through this role, I've had the opportunity to work with descendants programs and outreach initiatives like our USCT Historical Trails program. And if you aren't aware of it, in fall of 2022, the African American Civil War Museum had the opportunity to receive a grant from the National Park Foundation. And the grant funded us to go around the country and kind of leverage the memory of the United States colored troops at different sites. So we were able to interact with a lot of historic sites, a lot of national park sites, and just different museums throughout the country. And through this great program, we were able to connect with the Vicksburg National Battlefield with Brendan Wilson along with Dr. Beth Kruse. And we were able to hear about the amazing work she's doing to leverage the memory of the United States colored troops in Vicksburg. So before I get into her presentation, I'll share with you all just some brief information about her. So Dr. Beth Kruse is a Civil War and Reconstruction era historian centering the lived lives and experiences of minority groups in these turbulent periods. She earned her doctorate from the University of Mississippi in 2021, and she is currently the 2023 to 2025 National Park Service Mellon African American Civil Experiences Civil War through Reconstruction postdoctoral fellow at Vicksburg National Park. And her research and writing include the collaborative Southern Cultures article, titled Remembering Ida, Ida Remembering, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and Black Political Culture in Reconstruction Era Mississippi, and Vicksburg National Park Service Civil War Digital Humanities article, Massacre at Ross Landing. So Dr. Kruse is currently collaborating with other scholars in creating digital story maps, revealing the origins, actors, locations, and consequences of Vicksburg's 1874 massacre. So with all that information, I am going to pass it over to Dr. Beth Kruse, and I'm so excited to hear what you have for us today.
Thank you, Nia. Yeah, and I want to thank Nia and the African American Civil War Museum for creating this opportunity. I must also acknowledge, get my thing working here, the importance of the Mellon NPS partnership and allowing me to actually do history in such meaningful ways. And I want to thank the descendants for your engagement, your questions, and your attendance. I will strive to make this presentation helpful in your quest to find your roots. Soldier and widow pension files provide glimpses into a soldier or widow's experiences at a specific time, as well as revealing important information about their life before the Civil War. Pension files are useful in genealogy because they often provide names of parents, wives, and children, community origins and ties, health markers that may be generic traits, as well as when and where soldiers, their spouses, children, or parents died. On occasion, there are even images of soldiers. Pension files include a wide array of documentation, including the original applications, which is a simple question survey asking for service information, injuries, and dependents. The supplemental documents support the initial form and include marriage, birth, death records, affidavits from family, friends, comrades, officers, and even enemies. Pension files also include surgeon affidavits and diagrams detailing health issues or a soldier's death in the war. Physical locations are revealed, placing where a USCT soldier or his widow was enslaved, stationed, died, or moved post-war. Knowing where the soldier or widow lived and died provides opportunities to find more individual and personal information in state, county, and city archives. Other possible corroborating sources are finding diaries, letters, and regimental histories from the white officers, which may provide details about the company or regiment and, if lucky, an individual USCT soldier. No one document can reveal an individual's whole life, but collaboration from many sources, as one can find, combined with reading scholarly publication, reveals the antebellum, Civil War, and post-war experiences of African American citizen soldiers, both individually and collectively. Important primary sources I use when I search for the lives of the USCT, start with their pension and military files, then move to Census, Freedmen Bureau, and newspaper searches. I'm going to work through examples of those pension and supplemental sources today based on the previously submitted questions, and Neil will share my PowerPoint with everyone after the presentation. So deciphering the pension indexes is an important place to start. Here we have Corporal Benjamin Courtney's pension index, and it is an example of how a card is supposed to be filled out. Many, though, are not this detailed. At the top, we see the name, rank, company, regiment, enlistment, and discharge dates. Then the filing dates, including the original application, plus subsequent dates of petition changes. For Corporal Courtney, he first applied in July 1890. In 1907, he requested a change in pension benefits, likely for increased or new health conditions that restricted his ability to labor. In 1916, 4 years after he died, his wife received her widow's pension. This time frame suggests there is a detailed widow's story, and it is likely to do with the white male pension bureaucrats working to deny her benefits. Once an application was received, it was assigned a number for processing, that's that application number, and once it was approved, a new certification number was created. If there are no numbers under that certification column, then the pension was denied. The denied pension records are also available in DC at the National Archives. The law column includes bureaucratic shorthand for ease of clerks. Here, a J plus age means it's a regular file. If there was a C or an XC, that meant the soldier or his widow lived beyond 1934. At the end of this PowerPoint is a list of additional resources, and a couple of those will help in working through all the bureaucratic notations on a pension index. At the very bottom is one of the items I find most useful, since I'm often looking for exact death dates and searching for obituaries and newspapers or trying to locate grave sites. This one says that Benjamin Courtney died in 1912 in Cairo, Illinois. And indeed, I found that using the National Cemetery Veterans Administration Grave Finder, that he's buried in Mound City, Illinois. And Mound City is right next to Cairo, and it's a national cemetery. I do want to go back and look at his pension again and note the additional service box. Civil War soldiers often transferred from one regiment to another. This could be a sign of their individual agency, mustering out of one unit and re-enlisting in another. For white enlisted soldiers, they were promoted to officers in the USCT, which means a USCT index file often includes both an original state regiment and a later USCT regiment. For the African American enlisted soldiers, they too possibly mustered in as state troops, and in 1864, the U.S. military reorganized them into USCT regiments. Corporal Courtney's pension revealed he was originally a member of Company A, 1st Mississippi Colored Infantry. This is also known as 1st Mississippi Infantry of African Descent. African descent regiments were U.S. Army regiments. They were created from formerly enslaved men who self-manumitted themselves when the Union Army maneuvered south into succession states. When a USCT pension shows an additional service that links to a Confederate state, it does not mean that they belong to a Confederate Union. These are Union pension applicants for U.S. servicemen, their widows, orphan children, and sometimes parents and siblings. In fact, there were no recognized enslaved Black men who were supplied firearms and served as combat soldiers for the Confederate military. The Black Confederate soldier trope is a white myth created to support the lost cause loyal slave trope. There were state Confederate pensions for enslaved men who were forced to go to war with their enslavers. These pensions are Confederate indigent servant pensions. The forms clearly identify these pensions are for indigent servants of soldiers and sailors. The application questions include, what state did you reside in when you served as a servant? Were you wounded? Where? And are you indigent? These pensions, again, were state funded and controlled. The pensions were and still are used to promote the mythical belief that the central cause of the war wasn't about slavery and that the people they enslaved were happy and content. They were so happy and content that the enslaved men willingly went off to war to fight alongside those that held them in bondage. These are myths and tropes only. Servant pensions are a whole other presentation, and I'm not going to dive into this more than informing everyone If the family oral history includes that a Black enslaved ancestor was a Confederate soldier, it is a myth. And it likely points back to the confusion about understanding the Confederate States and pension index. If there is no U.S. pension, you might be able to locate an ancestor in a Confederate servant pension from a state archive.
Can you see me?
No.
There's one more interesting item that might be in a USCT pension index, and that is alias. When formerly enslaved men enlisted, they often provided the name given by their enslaver. Later in life, some chose to create their own free names, and this would show up, then they'd show up as their real name and an alias on their index card. Finding a pension index alias is sometimes the key to finding a soldier's military record, because the name they enlisted under is needed to locate the file. For Richard Vick, the alias Richard Wigg resulted from a language barrier and caused some difficulty for his widow Frances. USCT Richard Vick died of disease in the spring of 1866. Frances, his widow, submitted for a pension, but encountered a delay when her husband's name did not match his military file. Her relatively small 28-page file included their marriage record, death certificate, and an affidavit from 2 men of the 51st USCT, pointing to the reason why his military service card was erroneous. According to Privates Barry Friend and Jesse Taylor, both the captain and the first lieutenant of the 51st USCT were Dutchmen. Identifying someone as Dutchman was a term we associate today with Germans. The large group of 19th century European immigrants held on to their language and cultural identity until early in the 20th century. During the Civil War, the language barrier was recognized by Vick's comrades as a problem since the white officers were, according to the clerk, unable to distinguish the idiom of the American language. The lack of further documentation suggests the pension clerks took this as a valid explanation, and they approved the widow's pension. It is important to note that Frances's pension case was approved much more easily than most African-American widows encountered. One of the questions posed to me was to provide an example of a pension that was particularly interesting or revealing. I want to answer that they are all interesting and revealing in some way. One of my biggest realizations, though, came after my dissertation research trip to DC to look at Civil War prisoner of war pensions. After pulling several files, I realized the difficulties prisoners who did not incur battlefield wounds faced in receiving pensions if they only suffered from long-term effects of scurvy or exposure. Soldiers' pensions require an officer and a surgeon to validate wounds and disease, but in Civil War prisons, officers and enlisted men were separated, and no U.S. doctor treated Union prisoners held in captivity. On top of that, long-term consequences of malnutrition and some diseases were unknown in the 19th century. So proving the veteran's health was the consequences of his time as a prisoner was made more difficult. The files of men who were shot, on the other hand, were simple and contained few records. Then I looked at the few known USCT prisoners' files and their widows' pensions and was completely stunned. These files were often in multiple folders and contained hundreds of sheets of paper. One of the first USCT prisoner pensions I looked at was Private Alfred Green's. He was a member of the famed 54th Massachusetts who took part in the assault on Fort Wagner. The movie Glory catapulted the awareness of these soldiers' sacrifices, but unfortunately it heavily focuses on the victimhood trope of the massacred dead and omitted the story of the 50-plus soldiers who were captured and held in captivity from July 1863 to March of 1865. Significantly, USCT soldiers were the longest held prisoners during the Civil War. When I pulled Private Green's pension, I was looking for information about his confinement. I found amazing details regarding his wounds from the assault and his medical treatment in the hands of the enemy. This week, re-examining his documents, I found his genealogy on a 1912 letter. The government wanted details of Green's life and family in 1850 and 1860. His written response on the bottom of the typed letter noted his parents' names and that his father died before his birth. He also sadly recorded he believed his siblings were all deceased before 1850, but he wasn't positive because at 7 years old, he was, quote, put out to service and subsequently made his own way in the world, unquote. This information provides his descendants with the clues needed to search local Pennsylvania archives for more information. Private Green suffered multiple gunshot wounds and still carried a bullet in his pelvic area, so his pension was easily granted. But also included on Private Green's pension index was not one, but two women vying for his pension as widow. The lack of certification number means that neither woman was awarded a widow's pension. At this time, I do not recall why they were denied, but it was the widow's pensions that opened up a whole new understanding of Black women's power and resistance in overcoming systemic inequality for me. I questioned why African Americans' women's pension files were so large. The answer relates to multiple issues and legal hoops the women were forced to navigate. The requirements included proof of marriage, paternity of any minor children, and determining if the woman was of good moral repute. Morality played a major role in awarding pension benefits. If a man was a drunkard or an opiate user, he was denied. There was no recognition of alcohol and drugs use in relation to unhealthy coping skills for those navigating what we now recognize as PTSD. For women, their sexual lives were put under a microscope. And if any witnesses stated or even implied that she had taken up or was living with another man, her claim was denied. This was the easiest method for a pension clerk to deny a widow her pension. It was to accuse her of cohabitating with a male and living as husband and wife. Within the African American women's widows files, one will find multiple sworn statements from the widow denying they're living with other men. Harriet Caswell's pension file includes two notes written a few months apart, informing the agent that, quote, she has not lived with any man as his wife since the death of my husband. I have read other files where the agent is fixated on proving a widow is involved in what they call a promiscuous relationship at the time and results in dozens of witness testimonies denying or attesting to the sexual nature of the relationship. Occasionally, white men even provided evidence, usually swearing that the widow was living as a wife with another man, whereas the Black neighbors swear they were not. If there were conflicting reports, the white testimony would be accepted as truthful. The tone in Mrs. Caswell's second letter implies she is not pleased with the pensions agent's repeated questions, and this question was not asked again. But her fight for a pension continued due to fraud from outside parties and the stealing of her benefits from white men in Vicksburg. Harriet Caswell's file includes 155 pages of paper. The good news was that her pension was restored to her. The importance of family and community stands out in pension files. The requirement of others to testify to truths, especially in lieu of lost or non-existing documentation, reveals African American agency in the post-war years. Those who ran away from plantations together often recreated community in new towns. Their support for one another in obtaining pensions, documenting marriages, births, and deaths attested resilience and strength in overcoming systemic barriers to inequality. Their support for one another also transcended state lines, as seen in this 1901 One Act. Mrs. Georgina Berry, living in St. Louis in 1901, wanted to apply for a widow's pension, but needed additional information regarding her husband's service. Based on the St. Louis City Directory information, there at the top, it seems like she was likely married to John Berry and was indeed the widow. He belonged to the 50th USCT. Her chosen course of action included buying a one ad in a Kennesaw Parish, Louisiana newspaper. And it seems that this tactic worked, and she found the information needed to receive her pension. But it looks like it took several years to do so. One of the biggest obstacles for African American widows was providing evidence of their slave marriages and their children's birth and paternity. Files are full of notations by clerks. She was married during slavery, and according to its customs and usages, no record was kept of the marriage of slaves. In addition, plantation ledgers, if kept, were not available to the widows in documenting their children's births. I do want to note that some plantation owners did keep track of what women had which children. So plantation records and white enslavers' wills and property deeds do at times contain information that identifies familial ties to those they enslaved. But one must know the location and owner of the plantations. Again, community alleviates some of these challenges as the formerly enslaved men and women testified to witnessing marriages and births on plantations. The affidavits often include details of the enslaver, overseer, location of the plantation, and the name of the plantation. Plantation ledgers can be found in university collections and local, county, and state historical societies. The post-war testimony for events that happened in the antebellum years are entirely possible due to the newly freed men enlisting in same regiments and the fact that their wives followed the armies, setting up new communities near where the men were stationed during military occupation. The newly formed African American communities in or on the outskirts of places such as Vicksburg made it easy for USCT veterans and their wives to provide the needed pension affidavits. The U.S. Military and Freedmen's Bureau encouraged regimental chaplains to legally marry African American soldiers, which included sometimes remarrying the women they had previously married on the plantations. The reasons the U.S. government promoted marriages is multifaceted. One reason was to enforce 19th century ideas of white middle class as the epitome of civilization, and another was to reveal the inhumanity of slavery through coerced sexual relationships, which included the overwhelming evidence white enslavers were sexually exploiting the women they enslaved. Keep in mind, the enslaved men were also being exploited and forced into slave marriages or forced to reproduce against their will. The military created marriage records that purposefully collected data pertaining to sexual exploitation of the enslaved. The data included asking color of the individuals being married and the color of their parents, number of previous marriages, number of children, and why the relationship ended. The answer to dissolution were either force or death. Force meaning one of the enslaved was sold away from the plantation. For Purdy and Rachel Dodds, their marriage record reveals he was married previously for 4 years, creating 2 children, separated by force. Rachel was also previously married for 8 years, creating 5 children, again separated by force. Purdy nor Rachel claimed any white paternity in their lineage, but many do point to white fathers. Today, these marriage records allow descendants to find maiden names and understand the ties to others who only share half of a DNA strand. The half-sibling relationship details can be found also in the pension files. Looking again at Harriet Caswell's file, she reveals her maiden name was Jones. Her enslaver was Duncan McLeod in Sunflower County, Mississippi. Tom Garrett, the overseer, married her to her first enslaved husband, John Scott. In this case, the overseer Garrett was likely an enslaved African-American foreman. The names of her 2 sons from this first marriage were Henry and John. Robert Caswell was her second enslaved husband. He joined the U.S. Army and died of disease in Memphis. Another important detail in the forced marriages and dissolutions also played a role in approved and disapproved widows' pensions. Some of the women discovered their slave husband during slavery, joined the Army, and subsequently died. Some of these women were also raising their children from this union, so they filed for benefits. Issues arose when those USCT had legally married other women once they were freed. Due to the nature of these slave marriages and forced dissolutions, often USCT lacked any knowledge if their slave wife or children were alive when they were or where they were. In addition, some USCT were forced into slave marriages, and when they left the plantation, they felt no allegiance to the slave wife. Once the men obtained their freedom, they found companionship and love with other women and legally married. In the cases where there existed both a slave marriage and a governmental documented marriage, the military awarded benefits to the marriage that was performed by the U.S. Army chaplain. There are 2 other important records available to help corroborate and find your ancestors. The first is the 1890 Veteran Census. These census records are invaluable since the bulk of the 1890 U.S. Census records were lost in a fire. The 1890 Veteran Census is again that all too valuable piece to locate the home of your ancestor in a period where there was increased African American migration. The image I used at the start, as well as this one here, and one of the pensions was primary sources relating to 2 brothers. It is believed that this is the image of Baldy and George Guy from the 55th USCT. African-American fathers and sons and brothers often belonged to same units and stayed near each other post-war. Finding one of them is often helpful in finding the other. In this case, the 1890 census records find the brothers both living in the same county, in DeSoto, Mississippi. The 1890 Veteran Census also provides a section on the bottom allows for more clearly identifying widows, community and street locations, wounds, and other interesting notes relating to the soldier's service. I cannot recommend strongly enough for you to search for your ancestors in the 1890 Veteran Census. Lastly, I want to point to Freedmen Bank applications. When the freedmen banks opened accounts, the depositor was asked to provide some information about their life and family. For those who chose to answer the questions, they left a detailed record for their descendants. Henry Jackson, a veteran of the 66 USCT, opened his Vicksburg bank account in 1868. He noted he had no wife, but one son. The notation of no wife but a child again could point to a forced slave marriage, since he includes dead before the war when he identifies his father, John. It seems that if wife had died, he would also have included that information too. His mother was Irina, and he had 4 brothers and 3 sisters. The abundance of family information allows one to search census records to locate family members in 1870 and beyond. Some freedmen bank cards and the USCT that filled them out also included their sisters' married names, which makes filling out that family tree even easier. In conclusion, the barriers USCT and their widows face provided a positive for those of us looking for answers now, because the more documentation required, the more likely it is to find additional sources. Pensions are most helpful in providing genealogy, but military, freedmen, and census records all also provide corroboration and geographic information, which allows for searching state, county, city archives. If the enslaver is known, then searching archives for ledgers, property deeds, and wills before 1863 sometime results in tracing the lives and family of those enslaved. And lastly, search both African-American printed newspapers and local white newspapers for your ancestors. Key searches include obituaries, memberships in fraternal, political, and religious organizations. The predominantly white archival records require navigating those silences and reading against the grain to understand the information provided. Keep in mind, white 19th century newspapers or pension reports, they did not print facts as much as they printed stories and news items that were spun to promote worldviews that promoted racial stereotypes and buttressing systematic inequalities. I hope this presentation inspired new avenues for finding your roots, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, before we get into questions, I did want to say thank you for that really informative presentation. And just, I feel like we got a lot of different routes about how to research pension records, and not only pension records, but just other places you can go to find that information. So thank you for that. And then I'm also really interested in, I feel like I haven't really heard I've heard people talk about widows looking for pensions, but I think you explained a lot about why those processes are so hard, and I had never heard it like that. So thank you so much for that. Before we hop into the questions from program participants, there were a few that were dropped in the chat that I picked up on. So I'm just going to start with those 3. And if you all want to raise hands, and we can just go in that order afterwards. But the first question I saw was from Mr. Holman, and he asks, how do I find the officers' diaries to learn more about my family's Civil War soldiers' service?
You start in the state that the regiment came out of, or the state that the officer lived in. I'm originally from Illinois. I'm lucky enough to have the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library as where I could first start researching. They have a whole slew, of course, of documents. That's a good place to look. And I hope I stress this enough, that location, that geographical location opens up the avenues. And then from there, you can search historical societies, state archives, museums, and search, and hopefully you'll find something. A lot of the regimental histories, there's not many on the African American. There's a couple white soldiers did some, but unfortunately it's that whole, it's white men writing about the black regiments, and the white men talk about how great they are, and there's not so much detail into the actual enlisted soldiers. But there is some information out there.
Thank you. And another question from Mrs. Horton. She says that 2 of her grandfathers fought in Hilton Head, South Carolina, but didn't have headstones. Do you know if it's still possible to get headstones, or do we have to know the exact grave locations? Because she says we have 30+ United States colored troops buried on the island.
Yes, you do have for the Veterans Administration to put up military headstones, which they do. You have to know the name and the exact location of the grave. When you and often in the Vicksburg suffers the same problem. The loss of the names over the years. It's why there's so many unknown markers and things, what you can do. And what they did at the time, would they often would just make a plaque and say, within the cemetery, these men are here.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's a question that a lot of the descendants have. So maybe I can put some more resources in the chat for you all.
Yeah, and because I do link the Veterans Administration with that gravesite location. All the questions regarding veteran markers, it's the Veterans Administration is the one in charge of it. So, and they do have a page about what you need to get a veteran's headstone.
Okay, yeah. And that was in the presentation, right?
Yeah, so it's, yeah.
Okay, got it. I will drop that in the Descendants Facebook group. And then lastly, for the questions that I had in the chat, I see a question from Miss Wright where she said there was a serious backlog in getting pension records at one point, and has it become easier to request them and faster to receive them?
That's a Library of Congress or a National Archives question. I know that COVID meant the archives were closed, so everybody was requesting files remotely. I don't know what the backlog is. I have not requested any files. I usually go there. The other option is if you can contact HBCU that's in the area, and see if you could pay a student to go get your file for you.
That's a very smart, sleuthy way to get these pension records.
And I'm sure, Nina, you can help, hook the ancestors up with students.
Yes, definitely. So that was all for the questions in the chat. If anybody has any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Dr. Kruse is also going to give us access to the PowerPoint presentation, so I'll also send that out. But are there any last questions? Okay, I'm clicking through.
Hi, this is Phyllis Grimes. Hello.
Hello.
Ms. Grimes.
Yes, I had a question in the file, in the chat. And my question was in relations to the prisoners' pension files. Do we search those separate than we do for the regular pension files, the prisoner pension files?
No, you do not. I'm collecting prisoners' names as I find them. At that time, I'd found a document that listed several of the USCT associated with the 54th. If you have an ancestor with the 54th, you're golden, because all that stuff is so available so freely. But some of the others were not. So yeah, it's a matter of just going through and finding those gems. It's like, oh my God, this guy was a prisoner, or finding some other kind of record that points to. And in the military files, you'll often see when you read through the military files, it'll put a notation in there somewhere that somebody was a prisoner.
Okay. Thank you. Awesome presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I don't want to prompt on anybody, but Ms. Griggs, I did see you hopped off camera. So did you have any questions? We're all good? Uh-oh. Here we go.
I think that was a pretty good idea to ask for a student to go and pick up the records for you, even if it's somewhere else or in another state. If there's something that is there, that you can hire a student to do that. That's a great idea.
Yes, I did it when I was, because like I said, I was at Springfield, so I could go to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. So I did it when I was a student, and Vicksburg has Brendan, who's on this call, he has told me that they've had a student in DC that's gathered some information for them.
Great,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, I can jump in real quick on that. We actually, through one of the HBCU internship programs that the Park Service has, we had for 2 summers. One summer was COVID, so he couldn't do it. But the next summer, he went and digitized, photographed, and researched all kinds of regimental records for us. And it was a student at Howard. He was amazing. And then created content for us to be able to use it. So that was
Right. It's great.
And I'll just share because Ms. Cohen put in the chat that she's collecting pension records for Calvert County if anyone is researching there. So just a resource for that. But are there any last questions before we close out? And I just want to remind you all, if you joined late, that we are sending out the presentation and also a recording. Okay, I'm seeing that people are using the ways you're talking about to get these records, which is so smart. But okay, I'm going to, I guess we'll stop there if nobody else has any other questions. I want to give a big thank you to Vicksburg National Battlefield, specifically Dr. Kruse and Brendan Wilson. You all have been a great resource in just furthering and helping us progress this United States Colored Troops Historic Trail Project. So thank you so much, and we hope to continue to collaborate and lean on you all.
We do too.
Well, you all have a great rest of your day. Have a great, safe weekend, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.